Right. And of course, we've seen Vladimir Putin came out right before that Swiss conference and actually put a genuine, legitimate offer for a negotiated settlement that has harsh terms for Ukraine. But as you said, and just did there very eloquently, it's going to be worse if we wait till later. But here's an additional level of the problem. Even if what Sullivan said was actually true, and of course it's contradicted by other statements by other American leaders, uh, they're about to try and have a big happy dance and a celebration here in Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks on the 75th anniversary of NATO, where, according to what Blinken's been saying, we're going to announce either, if not an outright plan for accession to Ukraine into NATO, we're certainly going to talk like we're going down that path. And that runs completely contrary to having a negotiated settlement, because Russia will never, under any circumstances, allow that to be an end state.
I agree completely. I mean, we're really good at happy talk, and I'm sure they'll have this big celebration in Washington, and there'll be all sorts of hints about Ukraine coming into NATO and how deeply invested the West is in Ukraine's security. But I don't believe, Danny, that they're going to make any substantive move to bring Ukraine into NATO. This is just not going to happen. Stoltenberg spilled the beans when he said about a week and a half ago that for Ukraine to get into NATO, it had to first defeat the Russians inside of Ukraine. And as you and I both know, the Russians are not going to be defeated inside of Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to win this war. And the end result is Ukraine is never going to become a member of NATO.
But so now here's my concern, going back to what you said a second ago, is that there are multiple pressures on Vladimir Putin. He has his objective that he wants, which is to basically defeat Ukraine, have a neutral Ukraine in between him and NATO, and some kind of prospect that they can have a peaceful coexistence with the West. But he's also under pressure by some of the hardliners, and actually many people in Russia, especially after this Sevastopol strike, which is such an emotional deal, combined with other terrorist actions that happened on the same day. They want some kind of a response. And depending on what he chooses to do here, I mean, it seems like at some point that he may be willing to do something stronger, or may have to do something, or at least be under pressure for it. That's my worry about the escalation potential and our policies, which don't seem to be doing anything to bring it to an end. What do you see as the risk that this has some kind of an escalatory ladder process that could end up bad for our side?
Well, as I said, I don't think that'll happen, but let's assume that I'm wrong and what you're saying proves to be correct. I mean, let's say that the Russians were to target, a weapons depot in the eastern part of Poland or in the eastern part of Romania, to actually up the ante in a really serious way. The question you have to ask yourself is, what are we going to do? And I don't think there's much we can do. What are we going to do? Launch American missiles at the Russian homeland? We're not talking about HIMARS here or ATACMS. We're talking about, missiles, based in Western Europe or based on submarines or flown by American aircraft. Are we going to do that? I don't think so. So I think if you go up the escalation ladder, as a lot of people want to do. I mean, this is getting back to General Keene's comments. He, like many superhawks in the United States, relish the idea of going up the escalation ladder because they think that we will dominate the Russians. I don't think you can tell a plausible story about how we win going up the escalation ladder. And when you take into account that that escalation ladder has nuclear weapons on certain rungs, you're playing with fire. And who's ever in the White House is at some point going to back off very quickly for fear that that person is going to get us all incinerated.
One would hope that that'd be the thought. But, I look at what happens when we've had, strikes against our people in the Middle East. We immediately take, whether it's striking back in Syria or whatever. And if Russia does anything, if they make good on anything and an American or American interest is harmed, you're certainly going to have lots of pressure, just like Putin has from his right. You're going to have pressure on Biden from his side, like the Keene Warhawks, to do something to respond to that. Because I just can't. It's hard for me to imagine an American leader having a Russian do something and hit somebody and go, well, I mean, we had that coming. It's a tit for tat, so that's the tat. So let's just let it go. Which I think we should, but I worry a lot about trying to just one up a little bit more on the Russians.
I do too. I mean, I'm not arguing for 1 second that there's no danger here once you go up the escalation ladder. As I've said on many occasions, we fortunately have no experience with a major conventional war between two great powers armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. So we're not exactly sure what the escalation dynamics look like. And if one nuclear weapon was used, how that then leads to further nuclear escalation and where it all ends up is very hard to say, in large part because, again, we have thankfully never had a nuclear war between two nuclear armed great powers. So we're out there in virgin territory and nobody knows for sure how this will play itself out. But that gives both sides very powerful incentives to stay off the escalation ladder. And if they get on the escalation ladder, not to go up very quickly. Your point is that that may sound nice in theory, John, but in practice, you want to understand that these political leaders on both sides, both the Russian side and the American side, will be under tremendous pressure to escalate. And therefore, there's a good chance that they'll do something stupid. I tend, and I want to underline the word tend, to think you're wrong, but you may be right. And if you are, we are in really deep trouble.
Well, I really hope you're right. There's never been a time I want to be more wrong than on something like this. I'm going to shift over with the amount of time we have left to what we're doing in the Middle East, because unfortunately this is not the only area we got a problem. And as you said, we don't even have time to talk about the Indo-Pacific, which has its own issues that we could talk about. But what do you think that the U.S. could do, and what would you do if you were advising the president on given the messy situation, all the dynamics and everything that exists, we talked about, all the reality, what could we do to start to de-escalate this and bring it into a point to where it could actually be resolved, where somehow everybody saves face, probably except for the Ukrainians, because there's not going to be a good way out for them. But what would you recommend?
Just very quickly, let me note that we are basically involved in a war, very low-level war with the Houthis in the Red Sea, and we're not doing very well there. And you also want to remember that we fought against the Iranians on April 14th, when Iran attacked Israel on April 14th in retaliation for the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus on April 1st. On that April 14th day, we were involved in the fight against Iran. So it's very important to understand we've been involved on two occasions in fighting in the Middle East. And what we worry about is getting sucked into a war with Hezbollah. And we also worry about getting involved in a major war with the Iranians. The Minister of Defense in Israel, Yoav Gallant, has been in Washington over the past few days, and he's been putting pressure on the Americans to deal with the Iranian nuclear issue. And by and large, that means using American military force, maybe in conjunction with Israeli military force to quote unquote solve that problem. So the pressure here for us to do something militarily with Iran is going to grow with the passage of time. And there's a danger we'll get sucked into this war with Hezbollah. And we're already in a fight with the Houthis. So you then ask the question, which of course is the appropriate one, is what we can do to avoid a war with Iran, to avoid a war with Hezbollah, to shut down the war with the Houthis, and to shut down the war with Hamas. My view is that there's only one way to solve this problem, and that's to get the Israelis to fundamentally alter their foreign policy, because it is the war in Gaza, the Hamas-Israel war in Gaza, that is the taproot of all these problems, except for the Iran nuclear problem. And if you want to avoid a war with Hezbollah, and you want to shut down the war with the Houthis, and you want to shut down the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you have to figure out how to solve the problem in Gaza and the West Bank, by the way. And that involves us getting involved and putting pressure on the Israelis to change their policies towards the Palestinians, which are, of course, remarkably foolish, and adopt a smart policy. But the fact is, Danny, we cannot do that. We cannot put any meaningful pressure on the Israelis, in large part because of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States. All of this is a way of saying we're screwed.